You know, when I sit here on the porch of my little house in Willow Creek, with my hair already white and the sound of the wind rustling through the trees in the background, it's impossible not to remember my childhood. Each memory still tightens my heart, even now, at 75 years old. My name is Emily Parker, and I grew up in a home so simple that the wooden floor creaked with every step, and the walls seemed made of paper, unable to hide the screams from the fights between my father and mother. Our life was a constant cycle of struggle and suffering, all because of my father's addiction, Jack Parker. He drowned his frustrations in alcohol and spent whole nights playing cards at the town bar. We were 6 children. I was the oldest, 16 years old at the time when the story I'm about to tell took place. Next came Sam, 14, a boy full of energy, but marked by a sadness he hid behind a forced smile. Then there was Clara, the dreamer of the family, who was 12 and always carried a notebook where she drew the things she dreamed of having, like pretty dresses and a house with a garden. The twins, Billy and Tommy, were 8 years old and were like little hurricanes, always running around the house and trying to find joy in anything. Finally, the youngest, Sophie, was only 5. She was like a ray of sunshine, too innocent to understand all the pain around her. Our mother, Martha, was the true warrior of the house. A thin woman with tired eyes, but with a smile that worked miracles to give us strength. She washed clothes for the wealthier families in town, cooked, and did everything she could to make sure we never went without food, even if it was just stale bread and thin soup. As for my father, well, Jack was a tall man, with calloused hands from working in the fields, but with eyes that always carried the weight of bad choices. He wasn't a bad man, you know. He was just weak. Alcohol and gambling seemed to become his escape from the hard life we led, but it was an escape that brought terrible consequences for all of us. I remember nights when he'd come home stumbling, the strong smell of whiskey mixing with tobacco. He had a hard expression, as if he had lost more than just money. On those nights, my mother tried to avoid any confrontation, but she didn't always succeed. We, the children, would huddle in the corner of the bedroom, listening to the muffled screams and hoping the day would dawn soon. Our home, in the heart of Willow Creek, was next to an open field where the wind blew strongly, as if it wanted to carry our pains far away. But back then, I couldn't imagine a different future. The only thing that gave me hope was music. I had an old violin that a neighbor gave me when I was 10, and every time I played those worn strings, I felt like I could escape, at least for a moment, from everything around me. It was in this desperate setting that something happened that changed my life forever. At that time, I didn't know it, but my father's addiction would push us to the brink in a way I could never have imagined. It was a Saturday night, one of those nights when the cold seemed to seep through the cracks in the walls. My father had left early, and as usual hadn't come home for dinner. My mother, already used to it, sighed deeply as she put the children to bed. I stayed awake, sitting beside her, helping to mend an old dress that Mrs. Margaret, one of her clients, had asked her to adjust. When the clock on the wall struck almost midnight, we heard heavy footsteps approaching the door. My heart tightened. Jack walked in with a red face, the smell of alcohol mixing with tobacco. He seemed more nervous than usual, with restless eyes and trembling hands. "Martha, where are the children?" he asked, his voice slurred. "They're sleeping, Jack." "Why?" my mother replied, trying to hide her worried tone. He looked at me, still sitting at the table, then quickly averted his gaze. It was as if he felt ashamed. That's when he began to talk about the great opportunity he had found that night at the bar. "Emily, you're 16 now. You're a grown woman. Did you know you could change this family's life?" I was confused. I didn't understand what he meant. But my mother, perhaps already suspecting, immediately stood up. "What did you do, Jack?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Nothing much, Martha. I just got into a card game with Miss Carter, the richest farmer in the region. I was just trying to change our luck, you know." My stomach twisted. I knew what came next. Every time he tried to change our luck with gambling, things only got worse. "And you lost, didn't you?" my mother insisted, her voice now louder. My father ran a hand through his hair, nervous, and then let it slip. Yes, but it wasn't just money. My heart stopped for a moment. He looked at me, and at that moment I understood everything. He had bet me. My own father had put me on the gambling table, as if I were an object, something that could be traded or You bet our daughter, my mother screamed, horrified. Carter said he'd give everything to have a young worker on his farm. He promised he'd take good care of her. You don't understand. This could be good for her. Rage overtook me. I stood up suddenly, not even realizing it, and screamed. How could you, Dad? I'm not a piece in your... He tried to calm me down, but it was too late. The pain and anger had already taken over. Carter will come to get you tomorrow morning, my father said, his voice almost a whisper, as if he didn't have the courage to face my mother. That night was torment. My mother cried softly in the corner of the room while I lay staring at the ceiling, trying to imagine what my life would be like from that moment on. Working for Carter was the least of my fears. That man, nearly 60 years old, always looked at the young women in town in a way that made me shiver. I knew he didn't just want an employee. But deep down, in my despair, I decided I wouldn't be delivered like a piece of merchandise. Something inside me told me I needed to fight, that I couldn't let my father destroy my life because of his addiction. Dawn came quicker than I expected, as the first rays of sunlight streamed through the windows of the house. My heart beat like a disordered drum. I knew this would be the day my life could change. My mother was restless, pacing back and forth in the kitchen. She had spent the night awake, and the signs of fatigue were visible on her face. Her eyes were red, but there was something different. Determination. Emily, we'll find a way, she whispered, holding me by the shoulders. I won't let him take. The children were still sleeping. Lucas, the youngest at only 4 years old, was wrapped in an old blanket, holding the rag doll I had made for. My younger sister, Rachel, 8, slept beside him. They didn't know what was about to happen. Then we heard the sound of a car approach. Dust kicked up on the dirt road, and my entire body froze. There he was, Mr. Carter, stepping out of the car as if he owned the world. He wore a dark suit, a farmer's hat hanging on his back, and a repulsive smile on his face. Good morning, he exclaimed upon seeing my father on the porch. My father, visibly nervous, nodded and stepped down the stairs to greet him. Where's the girl? Carter asked bluntly, looking around as if I were merchandise waiting to be delivered. My mother pulled me back, blocking the entrance to the house. She's not going anywhere, Carter, she said, her voice firm. Martha, a deal's a deal, he replied with a cynical tone. Your husband assured me Emily would come. That's when something unexpected happened. I don't know where I found the courage, but I stepped forward and faced Carter. I'm not going with you, I said, my voice trembling at first but gaining strength with each word. I'm not a piece that my father can bet on. Carter raised his eyebrows, clearly surprised by my boldness. He took a step forward, but my mother quickly positioned herself between us. If you lay a finger on her, I'll take care of you myself, she said, holding a knife she had grabbed from the kitchen. The tension was palpable. Carter looked at my mother, then at my father, who seemed paralyzed, unable to defend his own family. For a moment, I thought he would insist, but instead, he gave a bitter smile. You don't know what you're doing, he said, before turning his back and heading to the car. I knew this wasn't the end. Carter wasn't the type of man to easily accept a no. But at that moment, he drove away, leaving my family in silence on the porch. When the car disappeared into the dust of the road, my mother finally let go of the knife, her hands trembling. This can't continue, Emily, she said, looking at me. We have to get out of... I knew she was right. That house, that life. My mother was a strong woman, but the years of suffering had left deep marks. Her hair was starting to turn grey, and her hands, calloused from so much work, trembled slightly. How are we going to do this, Mum? I asked, whispering so as not to wake my siblings in the next room. She took a deep breath, as if gathering the courage to say something difficult. I have a little money saved up, she said, sliding a small metal box across the table. Inside were a few bills and coins, saved over the years. It's not much, but it could take us to your Aunt Clara's house in Springfield. My Aunt Clara was my mother's older sister. She lived in Springfield, a larger city a few hours away. I vaguely remembered her as a cheerful and independent woman who always told my mother she should leave that dead-end town and start again. "And Dad?" I asked, my voice filled with uncertainty. My mother looked away, her hands gripping the edge of the table. "He made his choice when he started gambling and drinking," she replied bitterly. "Now, I need to make mine to save you all." We fell silent for a moment, listening to the sound of the wind outside. My mind was racing, trying to absorb what was happening. "When are we going?" I finally asked. "Tomorrow night," she said firmly. "When your father goes to the bar, we'll catch the midnight train." My mother spent the rest of the night teaching me what to do if something went wrong. If we got separated, I should seek help at a church or police station. She also handed me a small envelope with Clara's address and the little money she had, insisting I hide it in the folds of my dress. "No matter what happens, Emily, you have to move forward. Promise me you won't look back." I nodded, even though my heart felt heavy. The thought of leaving behind everything I knew, even if it was a difficult life, was terrifying. The next day seemed to last an eternity. My father, as usual, left for the bar shortly after dinner, leaving only the smell of alcohol and cigarette smoke in the air. My heart raced every time I thought about what we were about to. When night finally fell, my mother began to pack our few belongings. Each of us had only one bag, filled with clothes and essentials. Rachel, the youngest, insisted on bringing her cloth doll, while Lucas whined, not understanding why we were leaving in the middle of the night. "Shh, dear. It's going to be okay," my mother said, cradling him in her arms. I helped put the bags on the old cart we had. My stomach was in knots, and my hands trembled as I... By around 11 p.m., we were ready. My mother looked back at the house one last time before taking my hand and saying, "Let's go." The road was dark and silent, with only the sound of crickets in the background. With each step, I felt the weight of responsibility. I knew there were no guarantees that we would escape, but at that moment, I was willing to do anything to protect my family. When we arrived at the train station, my heart almost... There was a man standing on the platform, someone I recognized immediately. Carter. He was there, waiting for us. "Do you want to continue to find out what happens?" When I saw Carter standing on the platform, my legs went weak. He was wearing his usual hat, arms crossed, with that cruel smile on his face, as if he already knew he would. My mother stopped beside me, gripping my hand so tightly it almost hurt, but I knew it was fear that made her act that way. "Well, well, if it isn't Mrs. Anne and her little ones," Carter said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Did you really think you could escape?" My mother stepped forward, trying to protect us all with the little courage she had left. "We are not your prisoners, Carter," she replied, with a firmness in her voice I had never heard before. He laughed, a cold and bitter sound, and then took a step toward us. "Right? Anne, your husband owes me. I have the right to take what is mine. And if you don't want trouble, I suggest you hand over the girl." A wave of panic washed over me, but my mother remained still, like a rock facing a storm. "You're not taking anyone, Carter," she said, lifting her chin. It was at that moment that something unexpected happened. A figure emerged from the shadows of the station. It was Mr. Thomas, the old train conductor. He was a large and imposing man, with eyes that seemed to see beyond appearances. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice deep. Carter turned to him, clearly irritated by the interruption. "It's none of your business, Thomas. I'm here to settle a matter with this family." Thomas crossed his arms, staring down Carter without blinking. "Well, while you're in my station, it is my business. So I suggest you tell me what's happened." My mother seized the opportunity to quickly explain the situation. She spoke about my father's debts, the gambling, and how Carter was trying to take me as payment. As she spoke, Thomas's expression grew increasingly stern. "This is a disgrace," he finally said, looking directly at Carter. "A man like you should know that gambling debts are not paid with people." Carter began to protest, but Mr. Thomas raised his hand to silence him. "Now listen here, Carter. You may be a powerful man in this town, but here, in this station, I am in charge. If you don't turn around and leave now, I will call the sheriff and tell him about your wager. I'm sure he'd love to hear that." Carter hesitated for a moment, clearly furious. but he knew he was cornered. He shot one last threatening glance at my mother and said, "This isn't over." And then, with a frustrated grunt, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness. As soon as Carter was out of sight, we all breathed a sigh of relief. My mother fell to her knees, silently crying, while Mr. Thomas knelt beside her, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "You're safe now," he said gently. "Get on the train." I helped my mother to her feet as she quickly wiped her tears. We grabbed our bags and boarded the train, where my siblings were already settled, scared, but relieved to be away from danger. As the train began to move, I looked out the window and saw Mr. Thomas waving goodbye to us. He had been our angel that night, a man who gave us a chance to start. The journey to Springfield was quiet, with everyone exhausted from the tension and fear. My mother, however, held my hand the entire time, as if to say, "Everything will be okay now." Little did I know that what awaited us in Springfield would be a new chapter full of challenges, but also of hope. Would you like me to continue from our arrival in Springfield? When the train stopped in Springfield, the sky was just beginning to light. The rising sun bathed the city in shades of orange and gold, giving us a momentary sense of hope. We disembarked with our simple bags, unsure of where to go or what to do. My mother held Emma's hand, while my older siblings, Noah and Jack, carried the little we had. Springfield was different from everything we knew. The cobbled streets were bustling, filled with hurried and loud people, with vendors calling out their wares from colorful stores. For us, coming from a life of silence and open fields, it felt like a whole new world. My mother took us directly to the local church, as she always did when she didn't know where to. There, we were welcomed by Father Samuel, a man with grey hair and a kind gaze. He listened patiently as my mother explained our situation. "I lost my husband to alcohol and gambling," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "All I want is to give my children a decent life, far from men like Carl." The priest nodded, understanding without asking questions. "You are safe here," he said. "We have a small house behind the church that you can use temporarily. It's simple, but We were taken to the house, a small wooden cottage with 2 rooms. It wasn't much, but for us, it felt like a palace. My mother immediately began to organize it, while we children explored the garden and the surroundings. Life in Springfield started slow. My mother found work washing clothes for wealthy families in the city, and my older brothers, Noah and Jack, got temporary jobs at a salon. I, at 13, took responsibility for looking after the younger ones, Emma and the twins, Tom and Tim. It wasn't easy. Our days were filled with work and sometimes we missed our old home, despite everything. But my mother's determination to keep us together gave us strength. There were also moments of joy. The church organized small community parties where everyone was welcome. It was at one of these parties that we met Clara, a generous-spirited woman who quickly became a friend to my mother. "Anne, you have the heart of a lioness," Clara said one day, while helping my mother fold sheets. "I don't know how you manage to care for so many children alone, but I can see that each of them is a blessing." Even with so many challenges, I began to discover in the beginning, there were only simple melodies, but soon I realized that music was more than just a pastime for me. It was a way to escape reality. Father Samuel noticed my interest and began teaching me the basics. He would say that music was a form of connection with God and with the people around us. "You have a natural talent, Abigail," he told me one day while I practiced a hymn. "Never let anyone take that away from you." His words stayed with me, and music became a refuge amid the chaos. Would you like me to continue with more details about the family's adaptation and the challenges in Springfield? While my mother worked tirelessly to support the family, I wanted to help her in some way. One afternoon, while walking through the Springfield market with the twins, Tom and Tim, I heard a woman behind a flower stand shout, "Hey girl, you look smart. Want to help me organize these flowers?" She was Mrs. Margaret, an elderly florist with grey hair and a warm smile. Her calloused hands showed years of hard work, but her eyes sparkled with kindness. I told her I had no experience, but I was willing to learn. "Experience is learned over time," she replied. "Come tomorrow and start with me." So, I began working at the flower shop after finishing my chores with the twins. My tasks were simple: watering the flowers, arranging bouquets, and assisting customers. Despite being tiring, I loved that place. The scent of the flowers and the stories of the customers who came to buy arrangements for birthdays, weddings, and even to apologize made my days bright. Margaret also taught me important lessons about life. Abigail, flowers are like people. Some bloom quickly, others need more care, but all have their unique beauty, she would say. In addition to teaching me about flowers, Margaret became a maternal figure to me. She often let me take home unsold flowers. My mother always smiled when she saw a bouquet on the table. "You are bringing color to our home, my daughter," she would say. However, not everything was as rosy. Noah and Jack, who worked at the sawmill, began to feel the weight of responsibility. They were young and wanted to enjoy life like other boys in the town.
"It's not fair, Mom,"
Noah complained. "We work hard all day and have nothing for ourselves." Jack agreed but was quieter about his frustrations. My mother, though exhausted, tried to remain. "I know it's not easy, my children, but we are a family. We need to stay united." The fatigue and struggles began to spark small arguments at home. Despite this, we always found a way to resolve our conflicts before bedtime. My mother insisted on reminding us that we had something precious. Amidst the difficulties, something unexpected happened. One afternoon, while working at the flower shop, I saw a well-dressed man stop to buy an arrangement. He was Henry Aldridge, the owner of one of the largest hotels in town. He noticed how I organized the flowers and asked me, "Do you enjoy working with your hands?" "I do, sir," I replied, a bit nervous. "We need someone to take care of the hotel gardens. It's not very glamorous, but it's honest work. Would you be interested?" The opportunity seemed too good to be true. With the permission of Margaret and my mother, I began working at the hotel. There I encountered a world that felt so distant from my reality. Luxurious carpets, sparkling chandeliers, and people dressed in elegant clothes. The work was hard, but I was learning a lot. Moreover, I was earning a bit more to help at home. My mother cried tears of joy when I brought home my first paycheck. "Abigail, you are helping me more than you know," she said. "Would you like me to continue with more details about how this job at the hotel starts to change Abigail's and her family's trajectory?" Working at the hotel was a transformative experience. My tasks were simple: caring for the gardens, pruning the plants, and ensuring everything was pristine for the guests. But in that sophisticated environment, I began to see possibilities I had never imagined. The guests came from various parts of the country, and their conversations fascinated me. They spoke about travel, business, and life stories that seemed straight out of books. While I pruned the rose bushes or watered the flower beds, I listened intently, imagining what it would be like to live in a world so different from my own. One day, while planting new flowers, the hotel's housekeeper, Miss Eleanor, watched me for a few minutes before approaching. "You have a delicate touch with plants, Abigail. Have you ever thought about studying gardening or landscape design?" I laughed, a little embarrassed. "I don't know if that's for me, ma'am. My life has always been more about surviving than studying." "Don't underestimate your ability," she replied. "Opportunities arise for those who are prepared." Her words stuck with me. For the first time, I began to dream of something great. One day, while I was watering the shrubs near the main entrance, Mr. Aldridge approached me. He seemed excited. "Abigail, I've been watching your work, and I'm impressed. Our garden has never looked so beautiful." I thanked him, but what he said next changed everything. "I have a proposal for you. I would like you to help organize an important event here at the hotel. One of our guests is passionate about plants and is organizing a flower exhibition. We need someone who understands plants and has good taste. Would you be interested?" I could hardly believe. "Sir, I don't know if I'm qualified for something so big." He smiled. "If anyone is qualified, it's you. Plus, I will ensure you have all the necessary support." I accepted the proposal, though I was terrified. In the following weeks, I worked alongside professional organizers, learning everything about decoration and how to make the event unforgettable. On the day of the exhibition, the garden was transformed into a true paradise. Roses, orchids, and lilies adorned the space, and the lights created a magical atmosphere as night. The event was a success, and I received compliments I never thought I would hear. Miss Eleanor, who was also present, said something that moved me. "Abigail, you have talent. The world needs to know." That moment marked a shift in my life. For the first time, I saw that my determination and skills could open doors to a different future. My family, despite the challenges, began to benefit from this new phase. I used part of the money I earned from the event to buy new clothes for the twins and tools for Noah and Jack to use at the source. My mother, always worried about the future, smiled more, saying, "My girl is bringing light to our home." As I dreamed of new horizons, life continued to teach me. Even in the most difficult situations, hope can bloom like a resilient flower in the... If you'd like, I can continue to show how Abigail becomes a transformative force, not only for her family, but also for her community. Abigail's story is proof that even in the deepest adversities, inner strength and the courage to fight can transform life. She managed to break free from the shackles of her past and create a future filled with new opportunities, demonstrating that hope and perseverance are the keys to achieving the impossible. If you felt moved by Abigail's journey, subscribe to the channel to follow other inspiring stories like this. Don't forget to leave your comment below, sharing what touched your heart the most about this story. Your opinion is very important to us. Let's continue together on this journey of rescuing and preserving stories of overcoming, strength, and transformation.